In the middle of a celebration that was supposed to mark a new beginning, I realized my family was actually my greatest end. I am Seraphina, 31 years old, and this Lunar New Year, my own sister decided to ruin my life in front of everyone we know. You are nothing but a high-end parasite who drains this family's resources just to maintain your pathetic lifestyle in New York. Tabitha screamed, while more than 20 guests watched the red wine she intentionally poured soak into my expensive silk dress. The laughter that followed echoed through the luxury Upper East Side penthouse, a place they all enjoyed every single day, but apparently thought I had no right to occupy. My brother Garrison stood right beside her, adding his own venom by shouting that I was a penniless loser who had never contributed a single valuable gift to our parents, while I stood silently in the very home I was secretly paying for. You've spent your whole life bleeding us dry, and you've never once given anything back, Garrison bellowed while the room erupted in mocking cheers. Even my parents, Arthur and Beverly, offered no defense, instead choosing to share condescending smiles that signaled their silent agreement with every baseless accusation hurled my way. The air felt heavy as I realized my 3 years of silent sacrifice to keep this family afloat had only earned me betrayal and utter contempt from my own flesh and blood. I did not scream or cry, but instead I quietly recorded every word of their abuse before retreating to a private room to call my lawyer, Mr. Harrison, right there in the middle of the night. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever felt completely invisible or betrayed by your own family. You will definitely want to stick around to see how I reclaimed my life and my fortune from the people who thought they could break me. The world saw me as a quiet and unassuming woman who barely scraped by in a modest apartment, but that was a deliberate mask I wore to protect my peace from people who only valued net worth. While my family spent years treating me like a financial burden, I was actually navigating the high-stakes corridors of Wall Street as a senior fund manager overseeing billions in assets for elite clients. I maintain this humble facade primarily because I wanted to know if my own flesh and blood would love me without a price tag attached to my presence. You should really try to be more like Tabitha because she actually understands how to present herself in high society. Mom used to lecture me during our Sunday brunches, never realizing I was the one funding Tabitha's entire designer wardrobe. It was a bitter irony to sit there in silence while they praised the very people who were bleeding my bank accounts dry through secret channels and unauthorized transfers. My daily life involved 16-hour shifts of intense market analysis and high-pressure decision-making. Yet, I would return home to hear Garrison complain that I didn't work hard enough to contribute to the family's prestige. Sitting in my dark office after that disastrous Lunar New Year dinner, I began pulling up the digital blueprints of their entire existence, which I had meticulously constructed over the last 3 years. The most significant secret was the very roof over their heads, because that sprawling Upper East Side penthouse was actually owned by a private family trust where I served as the sole beneficiary. Arthur and Beverly believed they were the masters of that domain, yet they were effectively just long-term guests living on my silence and my monthly wire transfers. Make sure you don't stain the rug, Seraphina, since these are more expensive than your entire wardrobe. Dad had warned me earlier that night with a condescending smirk, unaware that I had signed the check for those exact Persian rugs 6 months ago. As I scrolled through the internal banking portal, the jagged truth of their spending habits appeared in cold and unforgiving numbers across my dual monitors. Tabitha and Garrison walked around the city with an unearned sense of superiority because they carried black credit cards that appeared to have no limit. What they never bothered to investigate was the fact that those cards were actually sub-accounts linked directly to my primary brokerage line. Their entire lifestyle was being propped up by my exceptionally high credit score, which allowed them to bypass every financial obstacle that would have otherwise crippled them. Whenever Tabitha walked into a designer boutique or Garrison ordered premium bottle service at a club, my phone would buzz with a notification of their insatiable greed. The deeper I dug into the recent transactions, the more my heart hardened against the two people who were supposed to protect me from the world. I discovered that Mom and Dad had been systematically siphoning funds from a secondary savings account I had set aside for emergencies. They didn't realize I tracked every single penny, so they thought I wouldn't notice the thousands of dollars being funneled into Garrison's reckless gambling habits. My brother had developed a serious addiction to high-stakes sports betting, and rather than forcing him to face the consequences, our parents chose to steal from their youngest daughter to cover his losses. "He just needs a little bit more time to get back on his feet, Arthur." I overheard Mom whispering to Dad in the kitchen last month, while they both looked at me with pity as if I were the true failure. The betrayal stung more than the actual loss of money, because it proved that my hard work was nothing more than a convenient resource for them to exploit. While I was sacrificing my sleep and my mental health to ensure our family legacy remained intact, they were treating my bank account like a bottomless well for their own failures. The sheer audacity of their behavior during the New Year's party was the final catalyst I needed to stop being their invisible benefactor and start being their landlord. I opened a heavy steel safe in my room and pulled out a thick folder containing several notarized loan agreements that Tabitha and Garrison had signed in moments of absolute desperation. These weren't just informal favors, because I had insisted on legal documentation every time they begged me for a bailout during their previous bankruptcies. I vividly remembered Garrison crying in my office pleading, "Please, Seraphina, if the bookies find out I can't pay, I'm dead, so just help me this once, and I'll never ask again." Tabitha had signed a similar document when her failed fashion startup nearly landed her in legal trouble with her creditors, claiming she would pay me back with interest the moment her next deal closed. They had likely forgotten these papers existed, or assumed I was too weak to ever enforce the terms against my own siblings. Looking at their signatures now, I saw them for exactly what they were, which was a trail of broken promises and evidence of long-term financial abuse. They had slandered my name in front of 20 people while knowing deep down that I was the only thing standing between them and total ruin. My fingers moved with clinical precision across the keyboard as I began the process of organizing every piece of evidence for the legal onslaught that was about to follow. I compiled 3 years of bank statements, property tax records, and the secret recordings of their insults into a single encrypted file for my legal team. There was a strange sense of calm that washed over me as I realized that the woman who tolerated their abuse was officially dead. I was no longer the daughter who sought validation through sacrifice, but rather the senior executive who was about to execute a hostile takeover of her own life. The documents in front of me represented more than just money, because they were the keys to a cage I had built for myself out of a misplaced sense of duty. "You'll regret this, Seraphina," a small voice in the back of my head whispered, but I quickly silenced it with the memory of Tabitha's wine drenching my dress. Every transaction and every signed agreement was a weapon that I was now prepared to use with absolute ruthlessness against those who mistook my kindness for weakness. By the time the sun rose over the New York skyline, I had mapped out a strategic strike that would strip them of every luxury they had taken for granted for so long. At exactly 6 in the morning on New Year's Day, while Manhattan was still heavily shrouded in a bitter and freezing mist, I found myself standing outside the glass doors of a prestigious office building. I had barely slept because the adrenaline of betrayal was still surging through my veins, pushing me toward a destination that would permanently alter the trajectory of my family's comfortable lives. My lawyer, Mr. Harrison, was already waiting for me inside his wood-paneled office with a stack of notarized documents that looked like a funeral shroud for their entitlement. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Seraphina? Because once these signatures hit the paper, there is no turning back from the consequences," he asked, while adjusting his glasses with a look of professional concern. I didn't hesitate for even a single second as I took the heavy fountain pen from his hand and prepared to dismantle the empire of lies they had built on my back. They made their choice the moment they laughed while I was humiliated. So now it is my turn to show them what a real parasite looks like. I replied with a coldness that even surprised my own reflection in the window. The first document I signed was a formal and immediate eviction notice for every person currently residing in the Upper East Side penthouse due to multiple violations of the private trust's financial security clauses. Once the eviction papers were secured, I opened my laptop to begin the second phase of the operation, which involved a surgical strike against their daily financial freedom. I logged into my primary brokerage portal and navigated to the section managing the authorized users for my high-limit black credit cards. My fingers didn't tremble as I selected the profiles belonging to Tabitha and Garrison, permanently removing their access and freezing every transaction currently in progress. I want to see the look on Tabitha's face when her double-shot espresso is declined in front of her socialite friends. I muttered while the system processed the final deactivation request. It was a necessary shock to their systems because they had treated my hard-earned wealth as if it were a natural resource that would never run dry. Mr. Harrison watched in silence as I systematically deleted the digital tether that allowed them to live like royalty while treating me like a servant. Their world is about to get very small and very quiet, Seraphina, so you should prepare for the tidal wave of desperate phone calls that will follow, my lawyer remarked as he began filing the electronic updates. The offensive continued as I picked up my phone to make a direct call to the premium insurance provider that covered the luxury fleet of vehicles they drove. I spoke clearly to the representative, informing them that I was officially withdrawing my sponsorship and canceling the comprehensive policy for the sports car that Garrison claimed as his own. Wait, you're canceling the policy for the silver Ferrari as well? The agent asked in confusion, and I simply confirmed that every single luxury asset under my name was to be stripped of protection. Without that insurance, the vehicle would become a massive legal liability that the police would be required to impound the moment it hit a public road. I also contacted the management office of our building to cancel the automatic payments for the homeowners association fees and all concierge services. Make sure the elite golf club membership for Arthur is the first thing to go because he loves that status more than he loves his own daughter. I instructed Mr. Harrison while he organized the final set of papers. As the sun began to peek through the gray New York skyline, Mr. Harrison confirmed that a team of professional servers was ready to deliver the legal packages to the penthouse. Each envelope contained a detailed breakdown of their debts, the eviction notice, and a formal cease and desist order regarding my personal finances. We have designed this legal offensive to be a total blackout, leaving them with no cards, no coverage, and no claim to the luxury they used as a weapon, my lawyer stated with a satisfied nod. I stood by the window and watched the city wake up, knowing that by the time my family sat down for their expensive breakfast, their entire world would be crumbling around them. Mr. Harrison handed me a final copy of the filings and reminded me that I should avoid all direct contact with them from this moment forward. Don't pick up the phone, Seraphina, because they will use every ounce of guilt they can muster to pull you back into the cage, he warned as I gathered my things. Before I left the office, I took one last look at the stack of documents that represented the end of my role as the family's silent benefactor. I thanked Mr. Harrison for his swift work during the holiday, and he promised to handle all incoming calls from their inevitably panicked lawyers. I walked out into the crisp morning air of Wall Street, feeling a strange and intoxicating sense of freedom for the first time in over 3 years. My phone remained silent for now, but I knew the storm was coming, and I was finally the one holding the umbrella while they stood in the rain. Every step I took away from that office felt lighter, as if I were shedding the weight of their expectations and their constant, ungrateful demands. The legal offensive was complete, and the pieces were all in place for a lesson they would never be able to forget for the rest of their lives. I headed toward a small cafe to enjoy a quiet breakfast alone, savoring the peace before the inevitable explosion of their realization began. By 10 o'clock that morning, as Tabitha stood confidently at the polished marble counter of the Gucci boutique on Fifth Avenue, the carefully constructed nightmare of her life finally began to unfold in front of her socialite inner circle. She was busy laughing while holding a limited edition leather handbag, loudly boasting about how our parents' massive inheritance allowed her to shop without ever glancing at a price tag. Just put it on the usual black card, darling, because my sister's little financial contributions are barely enough to cover my monthly shoe budget, she told the cashier with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. The store manager stepped forward with a strange and professional frown when the card reader emitted a sharp clinical beep that signaled a total transaction failure. I am terribly sorry, miss, but it appears your primary account has been flagged for immediate restriction by the owner, the manager stated while firmly holding on to the edge of the credit card. Tabitha's face flushed a deep shade of crimson as she tried another card from her wallet, only for the manager to calmly inform her that every single account was now appearing as permanently blocked. This is absolutely ridiculous. Do you even know who I am? Or should I have my father call your corporate office to fix this embarrassing mistake right now? She shrieked, while the group of wealthy friends began to whisper and pull away. Two burly security guards began to move toward her because the system had flagged the cards for immediate confiscation as part of a larger legal investigation into unauthorized spending. The group of friends who had been admiring her just moments before now began to exchange looks of sharp judgment and cold mockery. I'm so sorry, Tabitha, but we really have a lunch reservation at Le Cuckoo that we simply cannot afford to miss while you settle your little banking issues, one of them remarked with a condescending smile before the entire group walked out and left her standing alone. While Tabitha was experiencing the ultimate social death in Manhattan, a much more permanent catastrophe was arriving at the front door of our luxury Upper East Side penthouse. Arthur and Beverly were lounging in the living room, still discussing the previous night's entertainment when the doorbell rang with a persistent and aggressive authority that demanded their immediate attention. Dad opened the door to find two professional process servers who handed him a thick yellow envelope before proceeding to tape a bright orange legal notice directly onto the mahogany wood. This property is officially under a stay of eviction, and you have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the local sheriff arrives to remove your belongings by force, the lead server stated with a voice that carried no room for negotiation. Mom came rushing over, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion, as she demanded to know what kind of sick joke they were playing on a holiday morning. You can't do this. My daughter pays for this place, and I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately before I call the police. She screamed while the servers simply walked away without uttering another word. The reality of their situation didn't truly sink in until they tried to call their high-priced attorney, only to realize that the high-speed internet and the dedicated landlines had been disconnected without any prior warning. Every luxury amenity that they had taken for granted, from the building's private concierge service to the biometric elevator access, had been systematically deactivated by the trust management team. The most devastating blow came when Arthur finally managed to locate the safe, where he believed the original property deeds were being kept for safekeeping under his absolute control. He tore through the organized files with desperate and shaking hands, but instead of a deed of ownership, he found a collection of ironclad lease agreements that listed Seraphina as the sole landlord. The documents clearly stated that their residency was entirely contingent on a code of conduct and financial transparency that they had repeatedly and arrogantly violated over the past 3 years. This can't be right, because Seraphina is just a quiet analyst who barely makes enough to cover her own rent in that dingy apartment she pretends to live in. Beverly screamed while looking at the signatures that proved her youngest daughter owned every square inch of the floor beneath her feet. They realized with a sickening clarity that the daughter they had publicly slandered as a parasite was actually the one who had been paying the property taxes and the staggering maintenance fees all along. She tricked us, Arthur. She sat there and let us call her a loser while she was holding the keys to our entire lives in her pocket. Beverly wailed as the silence of the disconnected penthouse began to feel like a physical weight. Garrison tried to burst through the front door minutes later, his hair disheveled and his face pale with a terror that suggested he had already encountered his own share of the fallout. "The car is gone, Dad, and the bank told me I'm no longer an authorized user on any of the accounts we used to pay the gambling debts," he yelled while pacing the hallway like a cornered animal. The realization that their entire foundation had been built on a lie that Seraphina had allowed them to believe was the most bitter pill of all for them to swallow. They stood in the center of the darkening living room surrounded by expensive art and Italian furniture that they no longer had any legal right to possess or sell for profit. "We need to find her. We need to make her fix this because she can't just throw her own family out on the street like trash," Garrison shouted into the empty air while realizing his phone had no service. The domino effect was now in full motion, and as the reality of their poverty began to settle into the air, the silence of the penthouse became a deafening reminder of their cruelty toward the only person who had actually cared for them. Seraphina's absence was now the most powerful presence in the room, and for the first time in their lives they were forced to face the cold Manhattan wind without the protection of her hard-earned wealth. By 2 o'clock that same afternoon, the man who had so arrogantly insulted my financial status found himself standing completely abandoned on the narrow shoulder of the I-95 highway. Garrison watched with a mixture of disbelief and impotent rage as a heavy-duty tow truck prepared to haul away the luxury sports car that had been his greatest source of pride. The flashing blue lights of a state trooper's vehicle illuminated the falling snow, while the officer calmly explained that the vehicle's insurance policy had been terminated earlier that morning. "Sir, I already told you that this car is flagged for immediate impoundment due to a lack of valid liability coverage and a reported breach of ownership," the officer stated while handing back a stack of useless registration papers. Garrison leaned against the cold metal of the guardrail, shouting into his phone, "This has to be some kind of clerical error because my sister handles all the premium corporate payments for this vehicle." The officer didn't even look up from his clipboard as he signaled the tow operator to lift the front tires of the silver Ferrari off the asphalt. Garrison frantically reached into his pocket to call Mom and Dad for help, but the moment the line connected, he was met with the sound of hysterical sobbing. "The penthouse is gone, Garrison. They taped an eviction notice to the door and the bank cards aren't working at all." Mom shrieked through the speaker before the call suddenly dropped due to a lack of available data service. He stood there staring at the blank screen, realizing that the digital lifeline I had provided for years had been severed with a single clinical stroke of a pen. Just as the tow truck disappeared into the gray horizon, a sleek black sedan pulled over several yards away, and a familiar figure stepped out into the cold. It was Julian, my best friend since college, and the only person who truly knew the extent of the sacrifices I had made to keep my family afloat. He walked toward Garrison with a look of quiet intensity, holding a tablet that displayed several months of incriminating financial records that I had authorized him to share. "Seraphina wanted you to see exactly where your loyalty led you, Garrison, because we have the receipts for all those secret payments you made to those toxic influencers," Julian stated with a voice as sharp as the winter wind. Garrison tried to snatch the tablet away, yelling, "Get that thing out of my face and tell my sister to stop this childish game before I lose my mind." Julian simply stepped back, with a cold smile reminding him that the game had ended the moment the wine touched Seraphina's dress the night before. "You spent 3 years biting the hand that fed you, and now you have to find out what happens when that hand finally decides to close into a fist," Julian added before returning to his car. The reality of his situation became even more humiliating as Garrison realized he didn't have a single dollar of physical cash in his designer wallet to call for a private taxi. He attempted to open his ride-sharing app, but a bright red notification informed him that his account had been suspended because the primary credit card was no longer valid. He was forced to begin walking toward the nearest exit, his expensive Italian leather shoes quickly becoming ruined by the slush and the salt of the highway shoulder. "I'm going to kill her. I'm actually going to destroy her for doing this to me in the middle of a storm," he muttered to himself while shivering uncontrollably in his thin designer jacket. Every step he took was a painful reminder of the luxury he had taken for granted while he was busy calling me a penniless loser. The phone in his hand was now nothing more than a useless piece of glass and metal, because I had also canceled the high-speed data plan that maintained his fake online persona. He looked like a shadow of the man who had been laughing at me just 12 hours ago now, reduced to a shivering pedestrian in the middle of a Manhattan winter. Back at the penthouse, the atmosphere had shifted from shocked silence to a state of absolute unmitigated panic as my parents realized the gravity of their new circumstances. Arthur and Beverly sat on the edge of the velvet sofa looking at the mountain of unpaid bills that they had ignored because they assumed I would always take care of them. "We don't even know how to navigate the basic banking systems without her login credentials, Arthur, and we have absolutely no liquid assets left," Mom shouted while throwing a stack of useless papers across the marble coffee table. They had spent decades relying on the labor of others, first through their inheritance, and then through the quiet exploitation of my professional success. The realization that the infinite well of Seraphina's generosity had run dry was a terror that surpassed any insult they had ever hurled at me. "She's not answering her phone. She's blocked all of us, and the lawyer said we have 30 days before we're literally on the street," Dad yelled while pacing the darkening room like a ghost of his former self. They were finally beginning to see that without the daughter they despised, they were nothing more than two elderly people with no home and no future. The silence of the apartment was no longer peaceful, but was now a deafening reminder that the person who had once been their protector was now their most formidable opponent. 2 days after my final shred of patience had completely evaporated, my family committed the ultimate act of desperation by storming the lobby of the global financial firm where I held a senior position. I was in the middle of a high-stakes briefing when the security team alerted me to a public disturbance involving 4 individuals who were screaming my name near the main elevators. Tabitha and Garrison were leading the charge, their faces twisted with a frantic energy as they tried to convince everyone in the lobby that I was a cold-hearted monster. "Everyone look at Seraphina, the woman you trust with your billions, because she is currently throwing her own elderly parents onto the freezing streets," Tabitha shrieked at the top of her lungs while waving a copy of the eviction notice for the entire world to see. Garrison was pacing back and forth shouting at the receptionists, "Call my sister down here right now before I start telling these reporters exactly how she embezzled our family inheritance to fund her career." The scene was a grotesque display of their entitlement, a final attempt to use my professional reputation as a hostage to force me back into my role as their personal ATM. They expected me to cower in shame or rush to silence them with a check, but they had fundamentally underestimated how much I had grown to despise their manipulation. I stepped out of the private elevator with a composure that was as sharp and cold as a diamond, flanked by Mr. Harrison and a team of specialized security personnel who moved with clinical precision. Instead of engaging in a screaming match, I signaled for the large digital display in the reception area to be activated for a very different kind of presentation. "If you really want a public audience, Tabitha, then let us give them the full story, instead of your pathetic and distorted version of the truth," I stated with a voice that carried to every corner of the vast marble lobby. I stood before the gathering crowd of colleagues and curious strangers, looking my mother directly in the eyes, while Mr. Harrison began projecting a detailed audit of their financial abuse. "Look at the screen, Mom, and explain to these people why Garrison needed $400,000 of my money for offshore betting accounts, while you called me a failure," I demanded while the brutal breakdown of their theft appeared in high definition. The gasps from the onlookers were audible as they realized the sheer scale of the betrayal and the audacity of the people who were currently trying to play the victim. Tabitha tried to interrupt me with more lies, but the cold weight of the evidence on the screen made her voice sound like nothing more than a desperate and hollow whisper. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from curiosity to absolute disgust as my coworkers saw the reality of the parasitic relationship I had finally decided to terminate. Mr. Harrison stepped forward to present the final legal blow, which was a permanent restraining order and a conduct injunction issued by the state Supreme Court that morning. The court has already reviewed the evidence of financial fraud and harassment, so any further attempts to contact Miss Seraphina will result in immediate incarceration. He informed my father with a professional tone that left no room for negotiation. Two police officers who had been waiting in the wings moved in to enforce the order, taking Arthur and Beverly by the arms to escort them toward the heavy glass exit doors. "You can't do this to us, Seraphina. We are your flesh and blood, and you owe us everything for the life we gave you," Dad yelled while struggling against the officer's firm grip. Mom began to wail about the sanctity of blood relations, but her cries were met with the stony silence of people who now knew exactly what kind of mother she truly was. Garrison and Tabitha were forced to follow behind them, their heads finally hanging in a rare moment of genuine public humiliation that they could not escape. I waited until they were nearly at the street before I delivered my final statement, ensuring that every word was etched into their memories as the definitive end of our shared history. "I am officially declaring the death of our blood connection, and from this second forward you do not have a daughter or a sister to exploit for your failures," I declared, while my security team formed a human wall between us. I demanded that they never appear within 100 yards of my home or my office again, or I would use every resource at my disposal to ensure they spent the rest of their lives in a legal battle they could never win. They looked back at me one last time, seeing a powerful woman they no longer recognized, realizing too late that they had destroyed the only person who had ever truly kept them safe. I turned my back on them without waiting for a response, walking back toward the elevators with the heavy weight of my past finally falling away with every step I took. The silence that followed their departure was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years, signaling the beginning of a life where my worth was no longer measured by the depth of their greed. 1 month after the eviction deadline had officially expired and the winter chill had turned into a relentless freezing rain, I stood across the street to watch the final moving truck depart from my former Upper East Side penthouse. The luxury building that had once served as a gilded cage for my family's ungrateful demands was now being prepared for an exclusive public auction under the supervision of my legal team. Mr. Harrison stood beside me with a digital tablet confirming that every piece of high-end furniture and original artwork had been inventoried for the upcoming sale. "The liquidation process is almost complete, Seraphina, and the proceeds will be immediately funneled into your private trust that no one else can ever access," he explained while the last of the mahogany crates was loaded onto the vehicle. I watched with a profound sense of detachment as the physical remnants of their entitled lifestyle were driven away to be sold to the highest bidder in a cold and clinical transaction. Just make sure their junk doesn't end up in my storage units, because I want every single trace of their presence erased from my ledger by sunset, I told him while turning my back on the building. My investment capital was finally being recovered and protected, ensuring that I would never again be vulnerable to the financial parasites who shared my DNA. I didn't feel any regret or sadness as I looked up at the darkened windows, because I knew that the people who lived there had never truly valued the roof I provided. While I was securing my financial independence, my family was forced to face a reality that was far grimmer than anything they had ever imagined in their worst nightmares. Because their credit scores had been decimated by years of unpaid debts and legal injunctions, they were unable to secure a lease in any reputable neighborhood in Manhattan. They eventually found a cramped and dilapidated apartment in a struggling suburb, a place where the walls were thin and the elevators were constantly broken down. How can you expect me to live in a place where the heating barely works and the neighbors scream at all hours of the night? Mom shrieked at Arthur while they sat on a pile of secondhand cardboard boxes. Dad had no answer for her because he was too busy trying to calculate how they would pay for basic groceries without a single functioning credit card. We need to call Seraphina and tell her we've learned our lesson, Arthur, because I simply cannot survive another week in this disgusting dump. Beverly wailed while clutching her moth-eaten fur coat. The most poetic justice was reserved for Tabitha and Garrison, who were suddenly forced to enter the workforce for the first time in their pampered and useless lives. Tabitha had spent her entire youth mocking service workers, but she now found herself wearing a cheap uniform as a junior housekeeping attendant at a mid-range hotel. I used to spend more on a single pair of shoes than I will earn in an entire year of cleaning these disgusting rooms. She complained to Garrison during a rare moment of exhaustion. My brother didn't have the energy to argue with her because he was beginning a grueling series of shifts as a manual laborer at a local construction site. Just shut up and help me move these bricks, Tabitha, because the foreman said he'll dock our pay if we spend another minute gossiping on the clock. He snapped back while wiping the sweat and grit from his forehead. They were finally learning the true value of $1 a lesson that came through sweat and humiliation, rather than through a silver spoon or a stolen black card. As they struggled to survive their new environment, I was busy orchestrating a total and permanent disappearance from their desperate and toxic world. I moved into a secret high-security apartment in a quiet corner of Manhattan, where the lobby was guarded by personnel who would never allow an uninvited relative to pass. I changed my primary contact information, deleted my social media presence, and instructed my professional network to treat any inquiries about my whereabouts as a security threat. They will eventually try to find you when the reality of their situation becomes unbearable, but every digital bridge has already been burned to the ground. Mr. Harrison assured me before he handed over the final set of trust documents. I felt a strange and intoxicating sense of freedom as I walked through my new home, knowing that the sounds of their insults would never echo through these walls again. My life was finally my own, a blank canvas that I could paint with the colors of my own choosing rather than with the gray shadows of their constant demands. Before the sun set on that final day of the transition, I took my old phone and threw it into a specialized shredder to ensure that the last connection to my past was physically destroyed. I had no interest in hearing their apologies or their excuses because I knew that they only missed my money and not the daughter they had treated with such profound contempt. The story of my family ended in a cold and lonely suburb, but my story was just beginning in the vibrant heart of a city that finally felt like home. I headed toward my kitchen to pour a glass of expensive wine toasted to the woman I had become, and prepared to enjoy a peaceful evening without a single interruption. The battle was over, the assets were cleared, and the parasite-free future I had dreamed of was finally a reality that I could touch and breathe. 3 years had passed since the afternoon I watched the last moving truck leave my life, and on a late Tuesday evening as I was stepping out of a high-profile charity gala, I found myself unexpectedly crossing paths with the ghosts of my past. My driver was navigating the busy industrial routes near the New Jersey docks when the car slowed down behind a line of heavy transport vehicles. Through the tinted glass of my limousine, I noticed a man with a hunched back and hollow cheeks, struggling to lift heavy wooden crates onto a rusting freight elevator. It took me several long seconds to recognize the gaunt and exhausted figure as Garrison the brother, who had once spent thousands of my dollars on designer watches without a second thought. Get those pallets moving right now, or you can find another job by tomorrow morning, because we don't pay you to stand around and breathe. A foreman screamed at him, while Garrison could only nod weakly in response. His once expensive clothes had been replaced by a stained, oversized reflective vest and boots that looked like they were held together by duct tape and sheer desperation. I watched him wipe a layer of sweat and grime from his forehead, with a trembling hand looking toward the horizon with a vacant expression that suggested he had long ago given up on any hope of a better life. Just a few blocks away in a cramped and noisy diner, I knew that Tabitha was likely finishing her shift as a dishwasher, because I had heard through a private investigator that she was barely surviving on minimum wage. The sister who used to demand front-row seats at Fashion Week was now spending 10 hours a day scrubbing grease off plates for people she used to consider beneath her social status. Table 4 needs a busboy immediately, Tabitha, so stop staring at the street and get back to work before I dock your pay. I could almost hear the manager's voice echoing in her new and harsh reality. The situation was even more tragic for Arthur and Beverly, who were now living in a tiny government-subsidized housing unit with nothing but their bitter memories to keep them company. They were forced to rely on meager Social Security checks and food stamps, a far cry from the limitless luxury and private chefs they had once enjoyed at my expense. I had been told that Mom spent most of her days staring at old photographs of the penthouse, constantly weeping about how they had managed to drive away the only person who actually cared about their survival. We should have just been grateful for the apartment, Arthur, because now we have absolutely nothing left but this rotting ceiling and our own regrets. She would often wail during their frequent and exhausted arguments. Dad had become a shadow of his former self, his health declining rapidly under the weight of the manual labor he was never physically prepared to perform in his later years. They had plenty of time now to reflect on every insult and every betrayal they had hurled at me while I was working 80 hours a week to fund their vanity. My driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, asking if I wanted to pull over or offer any assistance to the man struggling on the sidewalk, but I simply looked away and adjusted my silk blazer. There is no one out there that I recognize, so please just keep driving until we reach the city center without stopping. I replied with a voice that was as calm as the ocean before a storm. I understood with a cold and absolute clarity that any form of pity at this stage would only invite the same parasitic behavior that had nearly destroyed my mental health. If I stepped out of that car and handed Garrison a stack of cash, he would immediately find a way to gamble it away or use it to manipulate me back into his toxic cycle of dependence. I had spent 25 years being the family martyr, and I had no intention of sacrificing the peace and the empire I had built just to soothe a temporary pang of guilt. My new financial firm was thriving beyond all expectations, and I was finally surrounded by colleagues and friends who valued my intelligence rather than the depth of my pockets. I had built a legacy of independence and strength that was entirely separate from the names on my birth certificate, and that was a victory I intended to protect with every fiber of my being. The car moved forward as the traffic cleared, and I didn't look back even once as the industrial docks of New Jersey disappeared into the darkening twilight of the city. The most important lesson I learned through this ordeal is that family is never a valid excuse to tolerate or encourage a lifestyle of toxic laziness and entitlement. Just because someone shares your blood does not mean they have a divine right to drain your resources or strip away your dignity, while they refuse to contribute to their own survival. I realized that setting firm personal boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but it is a necessary form of self-defense that allows you to survive in an environment built on manipulation. Kindness is a beautiful quality to possess, but it must always be accompanied by a steel-clad stance and a refusal to be treated like a secondary character in your own life story. If you allow people to take from you without consequences, you are not being a good person, you are simply teaching them how to destroy you more effectively in the future. My success today is not a result of my family's support, but it is a result of the moment I chose to walk away and never look back at the people who wanted to keep me small. I am Seraphina, and I have finally learned that the only person who can truly define my worth is the woman I see in the mirror every single morning. Thank you so much for following Seraphina's long and difficult journey from a family martyr to a powerful and independent leader in the heart of New York City. This story is a reminder that it is never too late to reclaim your power and walk away from a toxic situation that no longer serves your growth. I would love to hear your thoughts on Seraphina's final decision, so please share your own experiences or opinions in the comments section below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more intense and life-changing stories that challenge your perspective on life and loyalty. Until next time, stay strong, stay focused, and always remember to protect your peace at all costs.